Dead hand. There was a small village in Ireland that lay on the edge of a large bog. The marshy land stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with small, bushy weeds and the skeletons of tall, ragged trees with branches that reached out like long, twisted arms. The soggy ground could be dangerous because it was riddled with many deep bog holes that were filled with black, murky water. The bog holes were often hidden behind clumps of foliage, and it was important to watch your step. If a man accidentally fell down a bog hole, he would never come up again. It was a fearsome place, if all the tales told about it are true. It was before my time, but I have heard many a strange story about the bog, and it would make your skin creep, just to listen to them. Every day, the men in the village went out onto the bog and toiled for hours, cutting the turf. They loaded it up into wheelbarrows and hauled it home to dry it in the sun. They used the turf for fuel, burning it in the fireplace to heat their homes. They were also able to sell it to make money. But, after the sun had set, nobody would dare venture out in the darkness onto that desolate bog. In the moonlight, the wind would whistle through the dead branches of the twisted trees. Those who lived nearby would often glimpse strange shapes creeping across the deserted stretch of swamp. There were rumors throughout the village that strange creatures emerged from the bog holes at night. People were so afraid that they refused to leave their homes after dark. There was only one person in the village who did not believe in these creatures, a tall young man by the name of Tom McManus. Everybody knew him as Long Tom. On his way home from work, as the light began to fade, he'd often whisper to his friends, "There's one." And they would jump and run. And Tom would laugh and laugh. Finally, some of his friends turned on him. "If you know so much," they said, "why don't you go out onto the bog some night and see what happens to you?" "I'll do it," said Long Tom. "Sure. Don't I work out there every day? Not once have I ever seen anything to frighten me. Why would it be different at night? Tomorrow night I'll take my lantern and walk out to the hanging willow tree in the middle of the bog. If I get scared and run, I'll never make fun of you again." The next night the men went to Long Tom McManus's house to see him on his way. It was the blackest of nights and thick clouds obscured the moon, blocking out the light. When they arrived, Tom's mother was pleading with him not to go. "I'll be all right," he said. "There's nothing to be afraid of. Don't be foolish like the rest." He took his lantern and, singing to himself, headed down the path that led to the bog. Some of the young men wondered if Tom wasn't right. Maybe they were afraid of things that did not exist. A few decided to follow him and see for themselves, but they stayed far behind in case he ran into trouble. They were sure they saw dark shapes moving about. But Tom's lantern kept bobbing up and down, and Tom's voice kept floating back to them, and nothing happened. Finally they caught sight of the willow tree. There was Tom standing in a circle of light, looking this way and that, whistling a happy tune. All of a sudden the wind blew out his lantern, and Tom suddenly stopped whistling. The men stood silent and still in the blackness, straining their eyes to see and waiting for something awful to happen. When the clouds shifted and the moon peeked out again, they caught a glimpse of Long Tom. His back was up against the willow tree and his arms were out in front of him, as if he was fighting something off. It seemed like the very darkness was alive with slimy, creeping things. Strange shapes were swirling about him. They could hear loud wails and awful moaning sounds. Then, the clouds covered the moon again and once more it was as black as pitch. By now, the men were on their knees, praying for dear life and calling upon the Virgin Mary and all the saints to protect them. When the moon came out again, Tom's face was as pale as death. He was desperately hanging onto the willow tree with one arm. His other arm was stretched out in front of him and something was pulling on it. It looked like a disembodied hand, with rotting flesh dropping off the moldy bones, and it had a tight grasp on poor Tom's arm. Stronger and stronger it pulled, until at last, Tom lost his grip on the tree and was dragged off into the night, shrieking like a soul in hell. That's what the men said they witnessed before Tom was swallowed up by the darkness. When the clouds blotted out the moon once more, the men turned and ran through the blackness toward the village. Again and again they lost the path and fell into the muck, struggling to avoid the deadly bog holes. In the end they crawled back on their hands and knees. But Tom McManus was not with them. In the morning the people searched everywhere for Tom. Finally they gave him up for lost. That evening, the villagers heard a cry. It was Tom's mother. She was rushing down the path from the bog, shouting and waving. When the villagers spotted her, she frantically gestured to them to follow her. Struggling to overcome their fears, the villagers ran after her, and when she came to a stop, they found young Tom McManus slumped against a willow tree, shaking and gibbering as if he had lost his mind. His left hand was raised in the air, pointing, and his wild eyes were staring at something only he could see. Where his right hand should have been, there was nothing more than a bloody stump. It had been ripped clean off. Nobody ever knew for sure what it was that he had seen. Some people claimed that he had been attacked by the dead hand, and others said that was just the talk of drunken, superstitious fools. The only person who really knew what happened that night was young Tom McManus, but he never spoke another word again. He spent the rest of his short life, barricaded in his bedroom, shaking and trembling through the long nights. He didn't make it to the end of the year, and when they lowered him into his grave, his grieving mother cried out to the people gathered in the churchyard and begged them never to be so foolhardy as to venture out onto the cursed bog in the middle of the night. Sunday morning. There was a young girl named Josephine who was habitually late for Sunday morning mass at her local church. She always forgot to set her alarm and wouldn't wake up in time. Finally, she got tired of her parents telling her off and decided she would never be late for Mass again. One Sunday morning, Josephine woke up at midnight. Unaware of what time it was, she thought she had overslept again and jumped out of bed. She quickly got dressed and ran out the door without ever looking at the clock. It was still dark outside, but it usually was dark at that time of year. It was very quiet and there was nobody else on the street. The only sound she could hear was the noise of her own footsteps on the pavement as she hurried towards the church. When she heard the church bell ring, she quickened her pace and took a shortcut through the cemetery. She got to the church just as the service was about to begin. She found a seat and took a look around. Much to her surprise, she didn't recognize anyone. The church was filled with people she had never seen before. They were all staring straight ahead and an eerie silence hung over the gathering. When the priest came out to celebrate Mass, Josephine realized he was a stranger too. The priest told the congregation to pray for the soul of a young girl named Françoise who had died the night before. Josephine was shocked. She knew Françoise and she had never even heard that the poor girl was ill. Something was radically wrong. She began to feel very uneasy. She looked around again and, as her eyes began to adjust to the dim light, she saw someone she knew. There was an old woman sitting at the back of the church. Josephine's heart sank when she remembered the old woman had died the year before. Looking towards the front of the church, she saw that some of the people sitting there looked very strange. Their skin seemed to be pearly white. One of them turned his head and Josephine discovered to her horror that he was nothing but a skeleton in a suit. Just a skull and some bones. This is a mass for the dead, thought Josephine. Everybody here is dead, except me. It's a specter's mass. She noticed that some of them were staring at her. Their eyes were filled with anger. It was clear to her that she had no business being there. Suddenly, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Nervously, she turned around and found her grandfather standing in the row behind her. He had been dead for 3 years. There was a worried look on his face. He leaned towards her and whispered in her ear. "Leave right now, while you still can," he hissed. "You don't belong here." Josephine immediately grabbed her coat and walked quickly toward the door. She heard hollow footsteps echoing behind her and glanced back. The dead were rising out of their seats and following her. Their faces were twisted in fury and hate. Josephine was terrified and she dashed to the door, a pack of shrieking ghosts snapping at her heels. She felt skeletal hands grabbing at her, trying to stop her leaving. She twisted and turned, struggling to free herself from their grasp. Her coat was ripped off and her hat was snatched from her head, just as she managed to slip out the door. Screaming and crying and almost out of her mind with fear, Josephine ran all the way home and told her parents what had happened. Later that day, someone came to the house holding what was left of Josephine's coat and hat. They had been found in the cemetery, torn to shreds. Room for one more. There was a young woman who had just started a new job in a large office building. She was walking to work one day when a long black hearse drove up slowly next to her, matching her pace. This made her nervous and she anxiously watched it out of the corner of her eye. The driver leaned out the window and called to her in deep, booming voice, "Do you need a lift?" She turned to look at him, got a terrible shock. The driver's face was incredibly hideous and deformed. His skin was a deathly pale and one of his eyes was noticeably higher than the other. The man pointed to the rear of the vehicle, which contained a coffin. "Room for one more," he said. Frightened by his bizarre appearance and unwelcome suggestion, she refused his offer of a lift. Profoundly disturbed, the woman ran down the street until she came to the office building where she worked. For the rest of the day, she couldn't stop thinking about the strange man in the hearse, and was glad when work finally was over. The woman worked up on the 9th floor and when the elevator came it was almost completely full. She hesitated a moment before stepping in. "Are you sure you don't want to come in?" asked a familiar, booming voice. "There's room for one more." The woman gasped. It was the hearse driver from this morning, eyeing her with his lopsided, horrible gaze. Now thoroughly spooked, the woman backed away stuttering, I think I'll take the stairs." The hearse driver just stared at her as the doors slid closed. The woman had only taken a few steps down the stairs when she heard a chorus of screams followed by a deafening crash. She hurried downstairs and discovered the elevator cable had broken and all the passengers aboard had plunged to a grisly death. The dream. Lexi Morgan had a dream. She was walking up a dark staircase and when she got to the top, she walked into a bedroom. The bedroom carpet was made up of large squares that looked like trapdoors. And each of the windows was fastened shut with big nails that stuck up out of the wood. In her dream, Lexi went to sleep in the bedroom, but during the night, a woman with a pale face, black eyes and long black hair slipped silently into the room. She leaned over the bed and whispered, "This is an evil place. Run away while you still can." Then the black-haired woman grabbed her arm. Lexi Morgan woke up with a scream and lay awake the rest of the night, shivering and shaking with fear. In the morning she told her landlady that she had decided not to go to Kingston after all. "I can't tell you why," she said, "but I just can't bring myself to go there." "Then why don't you go to Dorset?" the landlady asked. "It's a pretty town, and it isn't too far." So Lexi Morgan went to Dorset. Someone told her she could find a room in a house at the top of the hill. It was a pleasant-looking house, and the landlady there, a plump, motherly woman, was nice as could be. "Let's look at the room," she said. "I think you will like it." They walked up a dark, carved staircase, like the one in Lexi's dream. In these old houses the staircases are all the same, Lexi thought. But when the landlady opened the door to the bedroom, it was the room in her dream, with the same carpet that looked like trapdoors and the same windows fastened with big nails. "This is just a coincidence," Lexi told herself. "How do you like it?" the landlady asked. "I'm not sure," Lexi said. "Well, take your time," the landlady said. "I'll bring up some tea while you think about it." Lexi sat on the bed staring at the trapdoors and the big nails. Soon there was a knock on the door. "It's the landlady with tea," she thought. But it wasn't the landlady. It was the woman with pale face and the black eyes and long black hair. Lexi Morgan grabbed her things and fled.